we do have an interesting topic, which is repartnering and how it affects support and spousal support in particular. I know that's an issue that comes up with, sometimes with some of my clients. How about you, Steve?
So repartnering after divorce and its impact on spousal support is a complicated topic. It's not one, certainly, that we will do justice in an IG Live podcast in under 30 minutes. But for what it's worth, let's give it a go and let's educate our viewers as much as we possibly can on the subject. To understand the impact of repartnering after divorce and its impact on spousal support requires one to understand the laws of spousal support. And to understand the laws of spousal support, one needs to understand the difference between child support and spousal support. Child support begins the day that you actually have children. And although when you're in an intact relationship, you don't call it child support, you call it supporting your own children. After a couple splits up and they live in two different homes, we have this legal obligation called child support. It's the support of a child. Juxtaposed to that, spousal support is the support of a spouse. Once used to be called alimony, once called maintenance. But at the end of the day, spousal support is the obligation of the stronger economic partner following the breakup of a relationship to pay an amount of money per month to support their former spouse who is weaker economically. And in fact, in many cases, child support and spousal support go together. Why? Oftentimes, the stronger financial partner will pay both child support and spousal support to the weaker economic partner. But not always. There are cases where the children reside with the payor of spousal support, in which case there's a different formula that takes effect. Now, let's bring it right back to what is the law of spousal support. So the law of spousal support says that where a person has the ability to pay support and the other person has a need for spousal support, and there is some nexus between the relationship or the breakdown of the relationship and the need for spousal support, then spousal support is paid. So then the question becomes, when does it end? Actually, that's the $1 million question. Everybody that is required to pay spousal support asks that question. And in fact, most of the time, people that are in receipt of spousal support are worried, quite frankly, very nervous. When is this amount that I'm getting per month that's allowing me to pay my bills, pay my rent, pay for my food, when will it end? And that brings us to today's topic. Because in the normal course, spousal support ends when either the person who is being supported no longer needs it, or the person who is paying it can no longer pay it, or some other factors that might influence this. For example, death, or lottery winnings, or a mammoth inheritance, or the receipt of a significant sum of money for a variety of other reasons. So the question then now becomes, when a couple who split up, in my example, 5 years ago, and when they split up 5 years ago, the husband earned more than the wife, they reached a deal, or a judge made an order, the husband pays wife X dollars in spousal support, and now wife has met, fallen in love, and now remarried and is living with her new husband. The question for today's podcast is, does spousal support end? So I'm going to just stop right there, Leanne, and ask you to jump in on this.
Yeah, so it's an interesting topic, and it's a highly contentious one because, whenever someone has to pay spousal support, I find it tends to be something that is resented a lot. People understand child support and seem to have less issue paying for their children, but when there is a spousal support order, they tend to not be as happy about it. And when their former spouse repartners and, moves in with somebody or remarries, then, that often can cause the payor to say, hey, wait a minute here, can my spousal support stop? Why am I paying? She's with a new guy, or I'm using the that is example that it's the female who was getting spousal support, but there are situations where it's reversed and it's the male. But he's saying, wait a minute, she's living with a new guy. Their house is bigger than my house, or why am I continuing to pay spousal support? And one of the things with respect to spousal support is that there's two different types of spousal support primarily. And one of them is compensatory and the other is a non-compensatory. So Steve touched upon, the idea of need and means. So the need of the recipient to have spousal support, and then the means of the payor. And so certainly if there's a repartnering, one may look at, does that same person need spousal support the same way because she's now living with someone else? Her costs are either being split or, and there's another income coming into the home. So does she still have the same need? And that needs to be looked at. Compensatory support is a little bit different because it's based on roles that took place during the marriage. So, for example, in a longer term, what I would call more traditional marriage, where, say, the wife stayed home, she left the labor force, she helped primarily raise the children, was a primary caregiver to the children, and ran the household more or less, while the husband went out and earned an income outside of the home. In that type of situation, particularly if it's a longer marriage, the wife might be entitled to something called compensatory support. And the idea is that she left her job in the workforce and stayed home to the betterment of the family, to the betterment for the children, for the betterment of the husband who, continue to work, and just overall for the betterment of the family. So should she be compensated on some level for what she did by giving up her employment in the workforce, and then if she has to go out in the workforce again 15 or 20 years later, she's going to be at a different point than she would have been if she had kept working. So with that type of support, it may be a little bit different if there's a repartnering.
So you've done an excellent job actually establishing the two competing schools of thought on the genesis, the need, the purpose, and the utility of spousal support. And so just to recap, because I want to now take it and give our viewers the arguments on both camps for continuation in the face of repartnering, as well as termination in the face of repartnering. So just before I jump into those two arguments, I just want to say that on the non-compensatory side, in other words, where the weaker economic spouse has a lower income at the end of a relationship, or no income at the end of the relationship, in the non-compensatory model, that is a situation where the marriage, the relationship, or the breakup did not cause the weaker spouse to be the weaker spouse. In other words, that spouse would have been exactly where that spouse is, with or without the relationship. So there's no need to compensate that spouse due to the relationship. Whereas the compensatory side, that's a situation where, like you said, Leanne, it's traditional, where for example, the mother gave up career and employment opportunities as a result of the relationship, as a result of having children, and in some cases as a result of making concessions and sacrifices to support her husband's career trajectory. For example, in some cases, they have moved from city to city or from country to country. And in cases like that, judges will look at that and say, well, that spousal support is based on a compensatory support model. And the reason that is relevant when it comes to repartnering is because in a repartner situation, judges might look at the compensatory model and say, just because she remarried doesn't mean all of a sudden she now has all of the abilities, the vocational skills, the employability, and so forth, to make up for the lost career that she gave up as a result of the relationship. And so in a situation where she repartners, it may very well be that a judge will say the support must continue. Although a judge might say, I'm going to reduce the support, or the judge might say, I am going to add a termination date. In other words, if she and her new husband are still together in 5 years, maybe support should end there. Or a judge might say, we'll come back in X years, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years, and we'll revisit whether the spousal support should end then. Now, what are the arguments for why spousal support should terminate in the face of a repartnership? Well, the answer is, let's start with the most obvious. It's a non-compensatory model. The only reason spousal support was payable at the time was because there was a need and there was an ability to pay. The ability to pay might still be there in the face of repartnership or remarriage, but now maybe the need is no longer there. Now, let's use a perfectly good example. What if the wife, who at the time of the breakup was unemployed, she got a job, she now makes $50,000 a year, and in addition to that, she's married, and now is living with another man who makes $150,000 a year. And in that household, there's now $200,000 worth of income. In a situation like that, non-compensatory, she's now working, she's living with another man that's working and has a good pay, then in a situation like that, a judge may very well be inclined to terminate.
Yes, and I think, some of the factors that courts look at in these types of situations in deciding whether spousal support should continue or terminate in the event of a repartnering are things like the length of the first marriage. Obviously, if it's a longer marriage, there's more of a likelihood of it continuing than if it's a shorter marriage. The age of the recipient. Again, if you're older, and it's harder to find a job and things like that, it might be viewed that the support should continue longer than if you're, 30 and much more employable and it's easier for you to find a job. And also with respect to the new relationship, if someone remarries, that's a pretty good sign that it's a stable relationship and it's going to be around for a while. But if it's a situation where perhaps a couple's moved in together, someone's moved in with someone they've maybe only known a couple of months or something like that, then it may be arguable that the relationship is not that long yet. It may not be that stable. And so, maybe over time, the spousal support may need to be terminated. But at this stage, so early on, even though they're living together, it's premature for a court to make that decision. And another factor would just be the standard of living. If the payor has a much, much lower standard of living now as a result of the recipient remarrying, that would be a factor taken into account as well.
In a lot of separation agreements, not so much in court orders, but in a lot of separation agreements, people will put in clauses for the purposes of either review or a variation or a termination of spousal support. And those three words are very different. A review just simply means that we're going to review it to determine whether it should continue to be paid, and if so, for how much and for how long. A variation means when something happens, there's an automatic change. That's a variation clause. And then thirdly, a termination clause simply says it terminates when. The when could be, and in some cases the agreements specifically say this, the termination occurs when she has resided with another person in a relationship of permanence for a period of no less than, oftentimes it's 1 year, sometimes 6 months, sometimes 2 years. So there are agreements that specifically specify why and when there should be a termination. And in some cases, the why is the repartnership, and the when is when the repartnership lasts for a window of at least X months or years. Now, in practical terms, make no mistake, in the 30 years that I've negotiated such agreements, I rarely have found the person who knows that the spousal support will end when they repartner has gone ahead and repartnered. And in some cases, what they've done oftentimes, and this is, human nature, they repartner, they have a new partner, but they do not live together. They simply maintain separate residences, and therefore the spousal support continues. So sometimes it's actually better to not put that clause in the agreement, because that clause in the agreement is a flag to the recipient to not repartner, or at least repartner but not cohabit. The other thing I want to mention to the viewers is that in the last 10 years, we have seen a significant demand for lump sum spousal support. And the reason for that is it gives the recipient a known amount for she or he to exit the relationship with. And it's often a very large sum of money, certainly more than 1 year's worth of support. And it gives the recipient the guarantee that she or he will have that money in their hands right away, and that there will never be an attempt to terminate support, because there will not be ongoing support. So it's a bird in the hand, better than two in the bush. On the payor side, the lump sum has its pros and cons. The pros are they pay that money now, oftentimes because maybe there's liquidity from the sale of a home. They get a Miglin release clause from a former case called Miglin v. Miglin, whereby the language for what is now considered a full and final release of spousal support has been derived from. And therefore, for the payor knows, I'm going to pay this large sum of money, and I will never, ever have to pay spousal support again. There's a whole bunch of other factors that are wrapped up in all of that. When you pay spousal support per month, it's tax deductible, it's taxable to the recipient. When you pay lump sum, it's all tax-free. We're not going to get into all of those details, but there has certainly been a huge demand for lump sum amounts, because it gives each side certain certainties that they like or they prefer over the uncertainties. And the uncertainty is what we're talking about today, which is, what is the effect of repartnership? Because if you haven't figured it out, viewers, it's not black and white.
No, definitely not black and white. Now, I know one of our listeners has been asking some questions. Speak Your Mind podcast has been typing in a few things. So I just want to take a quick look at them and see if we covered, if there's anything we didn't cover. So she says, let's say the partner of the divorced parent doesn't want to comply in providing financial information, as they feel they are a separate relationship from their partner's previous divorce. Well, that's a good point.
It's a good point, but it is answerable by Form 13.1 of the family law forms. If you go to Google and you type in Ontario family law forms, and you were to pull up either of the Form 13s, 13 or 13.1, there is a box that says, if this case involves spousal support, you need to disclose the income of the other spouse in the home. And in some cases, people will write TBD, or they'll leave it blank, or they'll avoid it. But most of the time, a judge in a case like that will order the parties to disclose the income. And by the way, for the most part, income tax returns oftentimes will include the spouse's income in the individual's return. Top right-hand corner of most T1 generals will say, what's the name of your spouse, what's the social insurance number of your spouse, and it'll include the line 150 total income of the spouse there. So that's available on the party's income. But should there not be that forthcoming information, then it's a matter for a judge to ask for that person to provide.
Yes. Well, I think we covered the basics of this topic. I don't really have anything further to add on it. Do you have anything further, Steve?
Just on the subject of spousal support, just recognize that this is one of the areas of law that Leanne and I have talked about for now months, if not years, that is the most gray. There's a lot of certainties in law. There's certainties with respect to parenting and child support, requirements to get a divorce. But when it comes to spousal support, for us lawyers, it's the hardest topic to give answers to, because there's a lot of unknowns, and a lot of it has to do with future events that cannot be predicted, much like what is the impact of a future repartnership on the termination of support. It's simply not a black and white answer that lends itself to guaranteed conclusions. So I hope Leanne and I have been able to at least provide some parameters that will allow you to consider your rights, your obligations, and your entitlements on the subject of spousal support. It was a pleasure.
Thanks, everyone, for tuning in, and we'll see you here again next week on Divorce Explained.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.